There is a pattern that almost no one talks about openly, and yet once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. It shows up in the way people spend their Saturdays, in the way they structure their weeks, in the decisions they make when they receive a little extra money at the end of the month. The pattern is not about income brackets in the traditional sense, and it is not about intelligence or work ethic or discipline. It is about something far more fundamental, what people have been taught to treat as the scarce resource worth protecting. For most households, that resource is money. For a much smaller group, the scarce resource they are obsessively protective of is time. And that single difference in perception quietly drives an enormous divergence in long-term financial outcomes. To understand why this gap exists, you have to go back to the way most people are introduced to the concept of financial responsibility. From a relatively young age, the dominant message in middle-class households is that saving is the highest financial virtue. You save before you spend. You cut back where you can. You compare prices, clip coupons in a figurative sense, and treat every dollar as something to be preserved rather than deployed. This is not a flawed lesson in isolation. It comes from a real and honorable place, from generations of families who survived on thin margins and knew what it meant to run out of money before the end of the month. The instinct to protect cash is a deeply rational response to genuine scarcity. But here is where the system begins to quietly diverge. Saving money, at its core, is a defensive strategy. It is designed to protect what you already have. And while that protection is necessary at low income levels, it carries a hidden assumption that becomes more costly as income rises. The assumption that money is the resource most worth your attention. What this framing quietly does is train a person to spend their time in service of saving money, rather than spending money in service of saving time. A middle-class household might drive 20 minutes out of the way to save $12 on groceries, spend 3 hours on a weekend doing a repair they could hire out for $80, or spend 2 evenings comparing insurance plans to save $40 a year. Each of those individual decisions is defensible. In aggregate, they represent a systematic trade of hours for dollars, and hours, unlike dollars, cannot be earned back. The wealthy, broadly speaking, have internalized the opposite equation. Time is treated as the genuinely finite resource, and money is treated as the tool you use to protect it. This is not about laziness or indifference to cost. It is a structural shift in how the two resources are weighted against each other. When someone operating from this framework receives extra income, the first question is not, how do I save this? But rather, what part of my time can this free up? They hire out tasks not because they cannot do them, but because the hours recovered are worth more to them than the dollars spent. They pay for convenience, for speed, for mental bandwidth, because those things compound in ways that are difficult to measure, but very real in their effects. The mathematics here are worth examining carefully. Suppose a person earns $50 per hour in their professional capacity, and they spend 4 hours each weekend on tasks, errands, administrative work, home maintenance that could be outsourced for a combined cost of $120. From a pure savings perspective, they are ahead by $120. But from a time value perspective, they have traded 4 hours of potential productive or restorative time for $120. If even one of those hours could have been spent on a skill, a relationship, a creative output, or a form of rest that improved their capacity for the following week, the real cost of that trade is far higher than the ledger suggests. The wealthy do not make this trade consistently. The middle class often does, without realizing it is a trade at all. There is also a psychological dimension to this that operates beneath the level of conscious decision-making. When your primary financial strategy is saving, your attention is perpetually drawn toward subtraction, toward what you can eliminate, reduce, or avoid. This is an exhausting cognitive posture to maintain, and research in behavioral economics has consistently shown that it narrows thinking. Scarcity, whether real or perceived, consumes mental bandwidth in ways that make it harder to identify opportunity. It focuses the mind on the short term, on what is immediately at risk, rather than on what might be built over time. This is not a character flaw, it is a documented feature of how human cognition responds to resource pressure. But it does mean that the very mindset generated by a savings-first approach can quietly limit the strategic thinking needed to move beyond it. What the wealthy have often stumbled into, sometimes through inheritance, sometimes through early exposure to different financial frameworks, and sometimes through deliberate study, is a compounding loop that runs in the opposite direction. When time is protected, there is more of it available for high leverage activity. High leverage activity tends to produce better financial returns. Better returns make it easier to buy back more time, and more recovered time enables more of the thinking, resting, and connecting that sustains performance over long periods. This loop is not automatic, and it does not work without a base level of financial stability to begin with. But once it is running, it is genuinely self-reinforcing in ways that pure saving cannot replicate. None of this means that frugality is wrong, or that saving is a trap, or that spending money freely is a virtue. Those would all be misreadings of the underlying mechanic. The real insight is more precise than that. It is that the relationship between time and money is not fixed. It is a ratio that shifts as income and circumstances change, and the financial strategies appropriate for one level of that ratio are not always appropriate for another. Treating every stage of financial life with the same defensive savings-first posture means carrying a tool long past the point where it is the best tool for the job. The wealthy did not stop valuing money. They simply stopped treating it as the only thing worth valuing. And in doing so, they began to accumulate something that saving alone could never produce. The real insight is more precise than that. 168 hours in every week for everyone. The wealthy did not receive more hours. They simply chose or learned to treat those hours as the primary budget. Saving is a floor. Time is the ceiling. The strategies appropriate for survival are not always the strategies appropriate for growth. And recognizing the difference, knowing when to shift the weight from protecting money to protecting time, that is the recalibration that quietly separates two very different financial trajectories. You cannot save your way to time, but you can invest your way toward it. The shift is not dramatic. It does not require a windfall or a breakthrough moment. It requires a single, quiet change in what you treat as the resource most worth protecting. And once that change is made, the system begins to work differently. Not because the rules changed, but because you finally understood which one you were playing.